Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I'm Gary Snow. Today, I'm once again joined by the friend of the show, Shannon Appelcline, the author of the recently crowdfunded Designers and Dragons Origins. Shannon, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here again.
Well, we only talked like a little over a month ago, I would say, and in that time, your Origins book set was a huge success in my view. How did it go for you?
Yeah, it was terrific. We brought in $250,000 from backers, which, I mean, it is great to see that many people interested in what I'm interested in writing about. And those books are the product of 15 years of work, 5 years of work, depending on what you count. And it becomes worthwhile when people say, yes, I want to read it. So that was, so much more than we got from the first crowdfunding, and it is just so thrilling. And as soon as I recovered, I went right back to writing. I am currently working on book 6 of that series, or the continuation of that series, well into AT&D 2E land.
Well, that's super exciting, and I'm so grateful that you once again are joining us. And before we started recording, I mentioned that when we first did our very first episode of the year in review, it was 2022. So this is our 4th anniversary of doing this. And I had to look up what that anniversary gift is. And so it's flowers or fruit. So I don't know if I should be sending you a gift basket, a fruit basket at some point. But guess what? I'm in Canada and it's freezing here and you're in Hawaii. So maybe it should be the other way around.
Yeah, we certainly have plenty of flowers and fruit here, as long as you like dragon fruit and other exotic options.
Well, let's get into it. The year of 2025 in the tabletop role-playing game industry, it's always an interesting one, and perhaps maybe not as interesting as other years with the OGL fiasco and all that kind of stuff. But every year is like a little bit different. So, just on a brief kind of high level, where do you think the industry is at?
I feel like the industry is very strong. And the reason I feel like the industry is very strong is because there were all kinds of disasters this year, economic problems, mostly economic problems that are impacting the industry and everyone else. And the industry just kept rolling. I mean, there's certainly some companies that have been deeply affected by some of these problems. And we're certainly seeing like our freelancers deeply impacted by the issues with AI, which I know we're going to talk about. But the fact that we could have, I counted it as 2, 3 disasters, depending on what you're talking about, and that we're still seeing great product from a lot of great people, that says to me that we're strong. And I think a lot of it's just that the barriers to entry have come down so far. You can publish something not just digitally, but in print and get it out there. And the fact that there's so much innovation coming into the industry because of that, I think is much of what's making us strong right now. And the fact that D&D continues to have a high point, not just through the publications of Wizards of the Coast, but through the larger media ecosphere.
Have you been watching the new Stranger Things series so far?
I have not yet, but it is certainly on my list. I like to make sure the whole thing is available, and so probably the wife and I will start season 5 after we get back from our Christmas vacation, when we know it's all out there.
You're a binger. You don't like to like trickle it?
Not quite a binger. We'll always finish one episode and then give it a day or two to percolate. But once we sit down, we'll certainly watch it over the course of January.
And maybe the reason I ask is because typically Stranger Things, like that really coincided with the growth of D&D through 5e. And each season, they would like name a monster after a D&D monster. And then I think it peaked with the Hellfire Club. I think at that point, everybody was like totally in on like, I got to learn about D&D if I didn't know it. And it brought in a whole bunch of new players. In your sense, do you feel like all these like kind of indie games are like capitalizing on that, or is the halo of maybe Stranger Things kind of wearing off in general and not bringing people into D&D as a first step?
I think it's bringing people into D&D as a first step. I mean, the last season was what, 3 years ago or something?
Yeah.
And so we haven't seen yet the effect of season 5. You're totally right. The Hellfire Club, it seemed to be really putting D&D in the forefront in a way that we hadn't seen since they were playing in their basement in season 1. And so I think that really did interest people, and it's going to draw people into Dungeons and Dragons. And so the indie publishers, I don't think they are capitalizing on it directly, but indirectly when, someone says, hey, there's other things out there beyond Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, they haven't delved too far into D&D in this season so far, so I'm kind of seeing how that's going to play out. Like, there's still episodes left, so spoiler alert, I should have said that because you haven't seen
Yeah.
the first 3.
Well, all I've seen is what we saw at the end of season 4, which is pretty much hell has come to earth. And so when you have that, you don't necessarily need D&D anymore because you're playing the game in real life suddenly, just without the steam tunnels.
So let's get into one of those buckets that we talked about, some of the disasters, so to speak, or just like turbulences. The first one is the end of long-standing institutions, alarms and excursions, the APA. And I should note, I'll put up in the links above here that I did interview Lee Gold, so that you can get right from the horse's mouth the history and background of the alarms and excursions, but it finally closed its doors.
Yeah, I didn't know you'd done an interview, so I'm going to have to go back and listen to that. Lee Gold started Alarms and Excursions in June 1975. At the time, we had the strategic review running, but it was a year before the Dragon started up. That just speaks to what a legendary institution it was. She ran it for 593 issues. Not quite 50 years. She unfortunately had to stop this year because of her eyesight getting to the point where she couldn't really edit it anymore. And over that period, for anyone who's not familiar with an APA, it's not a traditional magazine. An APA, each contributor, and you might have 20 or 30 or 40 active contributors on a very successful APA, creates their own zine, which is maybe as short as 2 pages, maybe as long as 8 or 10. And then usually if you have a closely geographically linked APA, you get together and you have a collation party, and everyone brings their 20, 30, 50, however many copies of their APA. And they put them all on a table, and you circle around the table and you staple these all together to create an APA. I'm sure it's done differently in the digital world, but the last APA I did was in the early aughts, and there were still physical parties like that for it. And so these are really individuals' view of the hobby, unlike the kind of more institutional views that you get off of a magazine or something. And so what Lee has is she has 50 years of individuals' views of the hobby. And I've read through the first, 50 or so. She's had them available. I'm not sure if they're available anymore, so you could buy PDFs from her. And they're just amazing, those early issues, for what people were thinking about this weird new, D&D thing, and the, ideas they were coming up with, and the, GMing experiences that they were talking about. There's some what we'd call APs in those early things, descriptions of people's games. And it went on, and she had some real notables writing at various times. Steve Perrin was one of not quite the first writers, but an early writer, and lots of others over the years. And so Alarms and Excursions, besides being the longest running role-playing periodical, and I suspect it will be the longest running periodical that we ever see for the industry, besides just being this slice of life of the industry again and again over 50 years, it's a history of the industry. So I'm sorry to see it go. And for a lot of us, our biggest concern is, are those archives going to continue to be available?
And as Shannon mentioned, you can go to her website and order those. Each edition is $2. Help Lee out too. Like, I'm sure, to reward her for the many, many years that she has put into this. And in the interview, she was absolutely charming, and I also really loved her husband Barry, and the two of them ended up kind of being slightly part of the interview. It's pretty fun, actually. It's one of my fondest memories of my podcasting so far. So, anyways, it was very good, and I was sad to see it go, but just an incredible body of work that she put in, and it's really almost like the early days of blogs, because at that time, just like today, people put out a blog on a philosophy on role-playing games, and then somebody would respond to that in the next edition, and back and forth and back and forth. And it was just a real hub of activity of people like bouncing ideas off each other.
Yeah, so amazing. Sorry to see it go. Hopefully it will continue to be a great historical resource for people.
Another institution, and this one actually came as a surprise to me that they're Canadian. I had no idea, but RAFM Miniatures, I didn't know they were Canadian, and maybe that's naive on me. I just assumed like they were big for me as growing up. I remember seeing the packages and stuff, and I had no idea they were Canadian. I just thought they were like this big global empire.
Yeah, so you probably thought they were a big global empire in part because, I mean, they did lots of their own stuff. I think they did their own Call of Cthulhu miniatures as one of their notable lines, and others. But they also were bringing major lines into Canada. Ral Partha, who is one of the big U.S. manufacturers, and Citadel, of course, who is the, monster manufacturer in the UK. And so you were seeing them manufacturing pretty much all of the important figures for Canada. And of course, their RAFM ones they did themselves went out to the rest of the world.
And I think I just checked. I think they were like possibly going to be selling STL files or something like that. But I went to their website and it doesn't seem to be up and running. So that might just not have happened, or it maybe ended.
Yeah, I don't know. They were bought out by someone else 10 or 20 years ago. I've lost track of the name right now. So there is still a survivor, I think, beyond them that should have possession of everything.
And so another disaster, which we already kind of alluded to, but U.S. tariffs and in general, just economic instability.
Yeah, man. I mean, in my opinion, the tariffs are one of the worst things that's happened to this country's economy, at least since the savings and loan meltdowns. Because I mean, aside from the fact that most economists seem to think that they're pretty bad policy, they've been so erratic. Canada has China has a 54% tariff one day, and they have 145% the next day, and then it's put off for 6 months. No one can do anything. So, like Gloomhaven was one of the big Kickstarters from previous years that I was looking at, and they were getting ready to, I guess it must have been their second edition Gloomhaven game that they were getting ready to, bring in. And it was done in China, of course, because that's where it's economical to do a lot of this right now. And at some point they said, we're shipping to Europe. We can't ship to the US right now. Because, I mean, 145% tariff, which is where it was at that point, you're talking about doubling and a half the price of your manufacturing. That is far more than the amount of cushion you have, the amount of profit you have. So if they brought them into the US, every single product they sold would have been at a loss. The role-playing games haven't been affected quite as much because it's turned out that printed material is mostly safe from the tariffs. But we didn't know that in March, April, whenever it was. And I mean, there continues to be question. The rug could be pulled out at any minute.
Yeah, I even in my own little world of like delivering and having the HTS codes of, luckily, Canada is part of CUSMA, at least for now. That we know of, that could change it any day, as you know. But like we were able through Canada still to ship down there, but it's like that uncertainty that makes you kind of tentative about like even committing to a Kickstarter, because in 6 months or 7 months that might be completely different. And I know, like you said, even the books, like tabletop role-playing games, like when you do a Kickstarter, often I'll throw in a bookmark, I'll throw in a sticker, like that could get you flagged in the incoming border agency, that could be suddenly not a book anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I got my Dolmenwood Kickstarter a few months ago, and because I'm in Hawaii, they shipped it from Europe. The rest of the U.S., they brought it to the U.S. and they shipped out, but Hawaii and maybe Alaska came from Europe for some reason, and it had a map with it. And I was like, "Whoa, am I going to get screwed on this?" And I didn't. They clearly did the right thing, but it, that's just horrible that me as an individual consumer has to worry about, am I going to get a 20, 30, $50 bill? Because it's not even just the cost. If you have a tariff applying to you in the US, you can expect to pay fees on it, and it might be, hey, here's a $2 tariff on this and your $55 fee to go with it.
Yeah.
It's insane. And I think one of the scariest things for role-playing games was in the, spring period where people didn't know, hey, is this going to affect us or not? An old marketing person, logistics person, something from Wizards of the Coast said, hey, I just wanted you to know I've pulled out these case studies from a couple of role-playing products that were imported in the 90s where they said the exemption for printed material does not apply because they aren't used for passive reading. And so that's why I say the rug could be pulled out, because we just don't know when, there's a very authoritarian group in charge of most of the executive branch in the US right now. They could do anything at any time. They could, decide that role-playing games are bad, and so they're going to try and punish them and, bring up these old precedents. We have no idea. And so anyone working in the industry, I'd be horrified, terrified, printing anything right now for role-playing games, let alone board games where they already know that they've been screwed.
And I'll say if there's a silver lining, if you can take anything from this on a personal note, those tariffs almost apply like in the EU. Like I always get very frustrated when I send a copy of a book to somebody in the EU and then they have to pay VAT on it. So
Yeah.
if somehow that got removed as well, I think get rid of all those types of extra costs that I think are maybe unnecessary for purchasing a role-playing game. But with that said, some people thought, okay, let's try to onshore manufacturing in the US. And the case study is Quimbly's Toys and Games, who took over Peterson Games content. And to be honest with you, that kind of escaped me because I didn't know that Peterson either had failed or was behind on their Kickstarter delivery, which is kind of shocking that wasn't more top of mind for people, or angry letter ish for that.
I think, yeah, I think a lot of people were very upset with the Peterson Games failure. I think maybe we haven't seen it quite as much because a lot of it was more on their, big plastic figure covered board games. They have done a few role-playing games. They did some Cthulhu, D&D 5e books, that sort of thing. But I think we probably didn't see much of it for that because he was mostly over on the board gaming side of things. But yeah, they were behind on a number of Kickstarters, and Quimbly eventually, I think, bought him out and took the liability for sending those Kickstarters out and started up a US manufacturer. And this was all last year. This was before the tariffs. And they failed. I understand the company's still around. It is, dropped back a lot, pulled back, but their main lesson was it's not economical to do manufacturing in the United States and for board games. And
I was just going to say, I saw the mea culpa letter from the owner of Quimbly's, and they were like, "Yeah, didn't know." Which was kind of shocking. They didn't know how hard it was going to be to tool up a whole manufacturing company.
I want to say we could have told them, but obviously he knew a lot more and had a lot more depth. But it seemed very unlikely. I mean, things are really cheap in China. About the only thing that we can manufacture competitively in the US within our gaming areas are black and white books. I understand those. You can start to approach equity with China when you cut out all of the shipping that has to occur. But color books, no. Board games, no. And the chaos over the tariffs has made it so no one is going to try. Because, if there was this, protectionist tariffing, which again, I have disagreements just with that economic idea in itself. But if you said we're going to put 100% tariff on everything coming into our country, and if people had faith it was going to be here in 10 years, then maybe you could roll up manufacturing. Things would probably continue to be more expensive for us Americans, but we'd have manufacturing here. But with this chaos where, we don't know if the tariff's going to be 0 or 154% tomorrow, no one can do that. No one can make economic plans. All they can do is wait until the current administration is out of office and see where someone who isn't as chaotic lands.
And moving on to another potential disaster / like, who knows, I don't even know what to call it anymore, but AI intrusion into tabletop role-playing spaces. Obviously I think the de facto kind of voice for designers, at least for sure, is that it's an abomination, and that it's kind of hitting the easy button when there's a lot of people that have put in years and years of work honing their craft. And not only that, but the artwork that is being created is like actually being stolen or scanned or whatever input into the large language model so that they can be copied essentially. And yet people want to use that easy button.
Yeah, and as you say, it's not even just that they use the easy button, it's that they're doing it based on theft. I have someone showed me one of the first LLM art systems, probably in 2022. We were writing papers for a technical conference I was at. I was like, oh, cool. This, lets you create your own art. Neat for, something like this. And it took us a little bit to figure out, wow, this is based on theft. And we don't yet know for sure if it's going to be deigned legal theft or not. But, I have no question that it's ethical theft. And I have no question that it's pretty precise theft. For all of their claims that it's just training, we've seen in lawsuits how these LLMs exactly are almost exactly reproduced text from, I think New York Times might have been one of the lawsuits where they could show some of their paragraphs, not quite word for word, but 90% word for word. And I think Disney put out one of the lawsuits too, where they showed a lot of images of Marvel superheroes where, the images exactly are very closely looked like marketing posters and stuff they've done. Now, of course, Disney has gone in and actually is using AI now, but that's a whole separate issue. But it's the theft that's deeply problematic. And I mean, even aside from that ethical issue, I have deep philosophical issues with it. When we were growing up, I mean, even 10 years ago, we were told, hey, you're going to have cars that drive you around without you having to. That's great. That's the type of thing I want to see. I want to see us getting our time back and not doing the tasks that are, well, I mean, in the case of driving, dangerous. All of the mundane tasks. Yes, we would love to see computers take care of that. But the creative tasks, that's what we want to get our time back to do. I mean, I spent half of my time technical writing, and I spent half of my time working on, role-playing history content. And, as with many people in the creative fields, as with you, I'm sure, life is this constant balance, fight, whatever you want to call it, where we're trying to do what we can in our, probably more successful business careers to make the time, the money, et cetera, to be able to do the fun creative stuff. And so to have these systems that have been built by, non-creative people to try and take away the creative stuff, that's bullshit.
Have you noticed, even in your technical writing space, have a company started to go that path rather than have a technical writer?
I haven't had any problems with losing technical writing clients. I have had problems with technical writing clients handing me AI slop and say, hey, can you clean this up? And I mean, I'm not an artist, so I'm not a visual artist. And so I cannot always look at something and see that the art is AI slop. But as a writer, I can as soon as someone points it out. But I just don't have the eye to always see it. Some of it's really horrible, and so I can't. But as a writer, I can certainly see that, and the visual artist might not be able to see the same thing. And I get the, AI content that someone has written me, and for a while I tried to edit it for them. And I finally came to the conclusion that I would spend 2 or 3 times as much editing as when they used to hand me, the less professional stuff that they wrote themselves. And I'd end up with worse content. And that's because I think the greatest lie that the AI industry has told us is that their systems are intelligence, and they're not. They're, statistical conglomerations of words. They are words. They answer the question, what's the most likely thing to come after this? What's the most likely response to this question? And part of the problem is that I actually don't know what percentage is built off the internet, but I have to assume it is a vast majority, just knowing where the vast majority of human written content is. Anthropic got in trouble because they ripped off a whole bunch of books, and that's why they got sued for and lost for over $1 billion. But I have to assume most of it comes from the internet, and frankly, that's not going to be the best source for great writing. But it's not artificial intelligence, despite their claims. And so when I get something to edit from someone, it often has just random junk in it, and not being the person with the intent of the writing, I don't know what if that junk is actually random and what's intentional. And that's my newest tack with people who hand me AI writing is I say, I'm going to have to rewrite this from scratch. And, I'll read what they wrote, I'll get it in my head, and I'll write it from scratch. And that probably doesn't take as long as the editing does, and it probably comes out better. But I can also lose some of their intent. So as a technical writer, it is deeply frustrating because I know what I'm outputting is worse because the input is worse. Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, everybody I'm sure has dabbled with it, and I found it increasingly frustrating. It's like having an assistant that is dumb, and you're like going, "Okay, do this," and then it comes back, and you're like, "No, like that's so like not what I had in my head." So I just I found the whole thing frustrating. And then on top of that, though, I guess I have to ask the question. There's two parts of there's the creation part of it. So we love our bespoke designs and creativity, but if the audience doesn't care, are we in trouble if the mass majority of folks just go, I don't care, whatever, AI? And then you kind of see that with some of the publishers kind of pushing it into crowdfunding.
Yeah, maybe. We certainly seem to have a very vocal group of people within the role-playing field who are very unhappy when they see AI, call it out. Wizards of the Coast got called out a few times, not this year for once, but last year and the year before, I think. But Terraforming Mars was one of the first examples I saw of what you said. Maybe 2 years ago now, they put out crowdfunding for a whole group of expansions, and they admitted that they'd use generative AI just for some of the backgrounds and textures and stuff. And it definitely got some bad publicity. And I think it was a more than $1 million Kickstarter despite that. So, that says maybe the very vocal group against AI is a minority. There certainly are people that don't care. And I feel like I've always seen that people are often willing to take what is obviously a second grade product if it's cheaper, if it's easier. We've always seen that. And so I think it's a real danger. And it certainly means that I hope that we're going to see some legal precedents and other things like that to halt it. And I don't know if we will. But I think the biggest problem AI has is that it's garbage, and that companies are increasingly finding it's a garbage. One of the recent studies I saw said that 95% of companies using AI are seeing no, income gain from it. It didn't say if they're losing money or not, but they're definitely not making money from AI. And I'd have to assume they're putting more effort and other things into it. That's pretty big. And I mean, I think each of us in our expertise, like I said earlier, are able to see the, problems with it. The artist can see, the garbage perspective, the stupid blurs and, the six fingers, all of that. I can see the text that actually doesn't say anything and looks like what I might have written in a blue book in college for a class that I had not attended. Um, things like that. And so if we each see the flaws, that probably points out why AI is not making 95% of people money. And there are such vast costs, and a lot of it is based on money being traded around. Like, I'm going to loan you $1 billion, and then you're going to pay me that $1 billion for the server farm that I'm building. It's fake money, and it's unfortunately propping up at least the US economy. I don't know worldwide, and I'm expecting to see a really big collapse. And
Yeah, as somebody that was like around during the .com bubble, it has all the earmarkings of something like that, where there's like all these companies that don't really provide a valuable service, and they're getting investment because of the hype. And eventually, like, I mean, at that time, all you needed was like a cool .com name, like, like, I'm sure they've been purchased and repurchased since then. But if you had like pets.com and you said, I'm going to start a website for that, that was like, okay, let's invest in them. And same kind of feel to that with the AI stuff, is that it's all gonna maybe pop at some point.
yeah, so I mean, I point that out in part because that might be the solution to the problem. That yes, people are willing to accept the lower quality thing in mass, but that lower quality thing might be so much more expensive to make that it's actually not going to be profitable. Um, we'll see. It's a very iffy time. I have grown increasingly strident in my views of it in the last couple of years.
And moving on to a disaster of kind of feels the samey, but it's about the Diamond Comics and their distribution channels and their bankruptcy, and how that impacted a lot of people in the industry, and including Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah, this was another one that, spring or so, it looked like things were going to be horrible. Because it wasn't just Diamond Comics, of course, it was Alliance Games, because they are intertwined. I'm not quite sure what the final corporate breakdown was, maybe, but definitely one owned the other, or something. And Alliance, of course, was the combination of Chessex and Armory back in the odd odds, who were some of our biggest distributors for the industry. And so Alliance was the really, really biggest. I wouldn't be shocked if it was 80% of our distribution. And so, again, much like with the tariffs, and it was happening at the same time, Alliance, going out of business was just a horrible disaster. And it got bought up by Universal, who was a Canadian distributor, and, no problem. I mean, I'm sure some people lost out on some things. I didn't see news stories on it, if so. But the bigger problem turned out to be Diamond itself, at least the one that caused problems for people. And that was because Diamond was doing distribution for a very small number of role-playing companies and a lot of comic companies into bookstores. And so, and they were doing it on consignment, which means that people were handing them their products and they'd get paid when and if the product sold. And bankruptcies in the United States, at least, I don't know what it's like worldwide, are horrible. My dad often talks about stories. He's worked at a lot of technical companies over the years. He's an electronic engineer, works on radios and stuff, where, people would be escorted out of an office where a bankruptcy had occurred, and all of their reference books and stuff that they'd had in their cubicle were then seized by the bankruptcy and sold off. And I think he always managed to hold on to all of his, but he'd often, seize some of these books that had been seized and resold. And this happened like, 100 times worse in the Diamond comics, and that these books on consignment, the debtors who were owed money by Diamond Comics said, hey, these like 75 or something companies failed to fill out a piece of paper saying that they were actually the owner of this. So it's ours now. We're going to grab all of this consigned stuff, which, again, Diamond never had any ownership of, and we're going to sell them and screw all these companies. And
sell
one
them
of
at a discount, undercutting.
sell them at a discount, undercut the
Yeah.
actual publishers. And so like Paizo was one of the ones who got messed up like that. And I haven't heard a lot from them. They're a pretty big company, so they may be able to ride out what's a notable loss. But Green Ronin I have heard about, and that's because they're a smaller company and they had at least one big product going out into the book distribution, which was their RPG based on The Expanse. And they were planning to push another one out. They're doing one on N.K. Jemison's fifth season books. I mean, great for book distribution. And so this is like at least the second time I know that Green Ronin has been screwed by distribution deals like this. Back in the odd odds, they were working with someone called Ossium, who was a Seattle distributor. And they in that case, they didn't have their product seized, but they had their product sold by Ossium, and then they never got paid for it, which, I mean, about the same thing. And I think that almost put them out of business around 2005 or so. And this one, they've been able to do a GoFundMe. They've gone, hundreds of $1,000s of support from fans to pay legal bills. They've forced the Diamond debtors to the table to, talk about maybe not stealing their product. But it's a mess. And you said at the start that Wizards of the Coast was affected, and that was with the original Alliance thing. They were owed $800,000 or something by Alliance, and I have no idea if they got paid out on that as part of the purchase or not. We just don't see some things about that in the news.
And I'm sure if there is a resolution, they'll Alliance or Diamond will try to keep it hush hush as part of the yet. So we might never really kind of know what's going on, but hopefully they come to something that is a good outcome for some of these designers and publishers.
My main takeaway was poor Green Ronin. So if you're a Green Ronin fan, go look for their GoFundMe.
Yeah, and I'll try to put the link below for everybody that's interested in that. As well as that, as far as distribution goes, like digital distribution is such a key component for like a lot of indie designers, and it's kind of been moving into at least recently into there's some digital censorship and platform control, mostly based upon the payment partner.
Yeah, the payment processors. So the big problem is I think it was Visa and MasterCard. They started saying we're not going to process payments for not safe for work content, which this actually touches a lot on the technical writing I do, because I do a lot of work with people who are focused on what's called decentralized technologies, where the object is to get away from these centralized platforms, which just have too much control. And one of the people I work with, he talks very extensively. One of his main points is how if you control the flow of money, you pretty much control everything. That if you can stop someone's flow of money, you can take away all of their rights. You can take away their rights to free speech, of free commerce, all of them. And that's what these payment processors are doing. And, they have absolutely no business, dealing with what is being sold. Their business is take the credit card and say, yes, we have a valid agreement with this person. We will give you the money. And they shouldn't be doing anything else. And instead, Steam and itch.io are the ones that got hit by it hardest. They told them you need to remove not safe for work content. And so Steam, I don't know exactly what they did, but it's been described to me as not nearly as bad. But itch.io, which has been kind of where the really real grassroots indie work's been doing, the super small press stuff, because you can just upload your digital file there and people know to look there for the small stuff. They started de-indexing, so you can't search for it, anything that they deem not safe for work. And the big problem with this, even bigger problem, because that's a big problem itself, is quite often in this type of witch hunt, anything that's LGBTQ gets wrapped up in it. So if something has a transgender character in it, if someone has a gay character in it, they say, oh, that's not safe for work, which is, of course, utterly insane. But, that just makes the censorship even worse.
And that also happened through Drive-Through RPG with Rebel Scum was a notable
Rebel Scum.
issue.
It's a little harder to know exactly what's happening there because that turned out to be a singular case. A lot of us were really worried when it was happening. But apparently last year, Rebel Scum, which was a Star Wars parody, but a Star Wars, maybe a
Star Wars with the serial numbers filed off. Yeah.
Yeah, except meant to kind of satirize kind of some of the fascist rising in the modern day. And so deeper than just Star Wars with the numbers. It had real political, political things in it. And that turned out to be the problems. There's this introduction in it that talks about, one of the joys of the game is punching space Nazis, which, punch space Nazi, that's great. But it called the organization of space Nazis the Republic with a K. And then it said, hey, one of the reasons that we call this Republic with a K is so that you can say you're punching Republicans. And that apparently was the line that set Drive-Through RPG off, because they felt like it was glorifying real world violence. And maybe you can see a point there. But rather than actually talking about that point, what they said is, we ban games that have, and this is a real quote, overt political agendas. And, I see overt political agenda, and that reads to me as, a game that's saying something, a game that means something. And I was, bitching about it on Blue Sky. And I said, well, let's see, what on my shelf has an overt political agenda? Paranoia, definitely overt political agenda. Underworld, which was an anti-corporate science fiction superhero game put out by Mayfair in the 90s. And I think you could just keep going down. Does Dungeons and Dragons have an overt political agenda? Some people would say so, who are upset about the current woke designs of Dungeons and Dragons, but I don't think it really does. But I think a lot of the most meaningful ones and the vast majority of content coming out from the indie industry, it has overt political agendas. And so a lot of us saw that and thought, what are they going to start banning? And they haven't banned anything else. Like I said, the ban of Rebel Scum was actually last year. We just heard about it this year because the designer talked about it at, I think it was UK Expo this year. And then it got on Rascal News, and so it got some attention. But I'm hoping that's not as big of an issue. Drive-Through RPG has certainly occasionally censored a game, and most of the games that we have seen them censor have been racist games. And I think most of us have been pretty okay with that. I think everyone has their own mark for what censorship they find acceptable or not, sometimes being none for some people. But we felt, many of us, that censoring an anti-fascist game was problematic.
So switching gears now, we are going to move on to the elephant in the room, as always, WotC, and the current holders of the Dungeons and Dragons legacy. What's going on with them? 5.5 or 1D&D or whatever they wanted to call it. How did that go for them this last year?
Yeah, it's always hard for us to say how did it go from WotC because we don't get any real numbers. Mike Merles looked at the USA Today best-selling numbers for 5.5, and he was probably unimpressed. His numbers were not encouraging. He compared the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master Guide, and Monster Manual to Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which was dense rule book that was put out in 2020. It was during COVID, and so that might have spiked sales. But he noted, hey, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything had appeared for 3 weeks running on the USA Today bestseller list, and it topped out at number 5. And the Player's Handbook for 5e, it was up for 2 weeks, and then it came back for Christmas, but it topped out at 57. And the Dungeon Master's Guide was there for 1 week, and it topped out at 95. And the Monster Manual was there for 1 week, and it topped out at 85. So we don't know, but that one data point isn't super encouraging. We'll see more. I mean, we widely heard during the 4E era what a failure 4E is. And we have widely heard since that it was wildly successful and maybe just didn't meet WotC's expectations. So it's always a moving number until someone actually gets the digits for sales 20 or 30 years later, and we'll probably never see those for Wizards of the Coast. So all we can do is look at these little things like USA Today, Amazon numbers, ICV2, though I don't think they've done any numbers in a few years, and say maybe it's not looking as good as people thought it would.
And so, like, this wraps back to like what we were talking about a little bit earlier with like Stranger Things, and like, does the entry point of Dungeons and Dragons, is a rising tide raise all ships? Therefore, you can kind of plug your nose and put up with it, or is it one of those things that you don't even know how good you have it because D&D was bringing people in, and you kind of wish for D&D to like take a hit so indie games or smaller games can get some air? But like, where do you sit with this, like in your analysis of where we're at? And then on top of that, before you answer, it seems like as you mentioned, 4E was like not well received in theory, and it seems like every other one is kind of like that. And the only way to really tell is when they go, okay, guess what? Edition 6 is coming out, because they just want to like move on to like a fresh start.
Yeah, I think I believe, not in the general world, but in the role-playing field at least, that a rising tide brings up all ships. That the more successful D&D is, the more successful every other game will be. And I mean, certainly we see in our individual groups, we say, hey, I want to do Pendragon, RuneQuest, Mutant, Year Zero, whatever. And people say, no, I just want to do D&D. But I think for every group that has that problem, and I mean, I've never had that problem. I've had great success going back to when I was a kid of everyone wanting to try the other games. I think for every group that actually does do that probably there's another 2 groups that appeared only because of the success of D&D, or maybe 10 groups. I mean, D&D is so much more successful than anything else in the field that everything else is almost a rounding error. I mean, it's a great rounding error. It's what I write about. It's what many of us enjoy. It's what most of my shelves are covered with on my role-playing shelves. But D&D's success is great. And I was really worried during the 4E era when the products that Wizards were putting out were dropping, and then didn't recover in the 5E era, that was going to kill the rest of the industry. And it didn't, obviously. But at least, back in that era, aughts, tens, game stores were still very important. And drawing someone into a game store for the newest D&D product at least exposed them to the other products which were also on the shelves. And I think year by year we're seeing retail stores get less important, and that's kind of unfortunate for the role-playing industry, because there is so much a culture of demo and seeing how it really works and that getting into your games. I think it's going to be more damaging to us than whether you can buy Windex at a local store, or even a book. But I think D&D, I think its success helps the rest of the industry, and its failure damages the rest of the industry.
And then based upon that, there is this odd kind of like haphazard LinkedIn comment by one of the executives saying something along the lines of that WotC is going to move into the franchising era of D&D. which, obviously raised a lot of speculation what that means. Any kind of thoughts on that approach in the next little while for WotC?
Yeah, a franchise model. I think no one understood what that meant, and everyone was very angry about it. Um, so, I mean, it says to me that they're trying to, we're going to be putting out our own games, which they've talked about. Though, as far as I know, their science fiction game, Exile, whatever it was called, is the only one that I've really seen in moving toward production. We're going to do our own beach towels. We're going to do our own color farms, whatever, which are all things we've seen in the past for D&D. I mean, frankly, I think many of us think that Wizards of the Coast doesn't treat D&D like we'd like to see it treated. That they are too fundamentally focused on share price and shareholders, and so year by year they lay off their best designers, and they do things like the whole OGL fiasco, which was clearly entirely, money focused without any thought about how it would damage the whole industry, which is ultimately going to impact them. So I think them moving to a franchise model, if they are going to be just pumping out lots of crap, we're not going to necessarily be thrilled with that, especially if it lessens the amount of actually role-playing content. But we don't know what it means. We don't know what they're going to do. It's hard to say. Doesn't sound good, but it sounds like more, mealy-mouthed corporate doublespeak, which is mostly what we get out of Wizards of the Coast.
And then, as well as that, they had the Sigil VTT, which they soft launched, and then very quickly went, this isn't this isn't what we thought we were getting with it from their executives. And so they eventually laid folks off and then just shuttered it.
Yeah. So Wizards of the Coast, as you well know, has a really great history of not knowing what in the world they're doing with digital products. I mean, we remember GleeMax, their attempt to create a social media platform, which they didn't understand the model, they didn't understand what sold to their users, and they couldn't produce it. There was a virtual tabletop that they were going to do during the 4E era, which, it was laughable that year after year it got put off. And eventually they just bought D&D Beyond, which was clearly a much better model for them. And then they had Sigil, which was, hey, let's have a great, 3D modeled virtual world that, D&D players like the old Neverwinter Nights can create their own scenarios and put stuff in. And Neverwinter Nights, great model for that type of thing. Sigil, hard to say if it would have worked or not, but the word from insiders was that staff didn't know the difference between a virtual tabletop and a computer game, that they didn't understand that they were different things. And clearly they have very different economic models. I mean, a VTT is never going to raise the amount of money that a computer game does. But on the other hand, a VTT, you might be able to charge people $10 or $20 a month for a month after month, where, Baldur's Gate, I put out my $50, $80, whatever it was for it once, and have been playing it, for the last couple of months since I put it out to play with some friends, and we'll keep, but that's a one time. So, but they didn't understand it, and they were expecting to see, those hundreds of millions of dollars coming in immediately. This is according to inside people, presumably. And when it wasn't that, they said, oh, I guess we'll close it down. And, so now it's just another in a long line of digital failures, which perhaps does not speak well to them doing a franchise model, given they apparently seem to be drawing computer games in-house, and they don't know what in the world they're doing there.
Yeah, it didn't really seem like it was a VTT or a video game. It was kind of some weird hybrid that nobody wanted, is kind of my take on it, was that it didn't satisfy either one of those areas, and it was kind of like a clunky in between that like you almost can't use at the table. And so I guess that's what happened, is that they eventually went, this isn't working. I guess one positive note, let's give WotC their flowers. The release of the 5.2 SRD.
Yeah, that's great. A lot of people were afraid, dating back to the whole OGL fiasco, that they're going to try and use 5.5e, 1D&D, whatever the heck we call it, to pull the game back in and to stop people from making supplements. And they eventually had to backtrack tremendously on the whole OGL thing. And so maybe that was their plan, but they said, no, we're going to put the current SRD into the Creative Commons, and then we're going to do the same thing with 5.5 when we do. And so they did. It's the 5.2 SRD, confusingly enough. But it's out there. We know that they are not trying to lock D&D back up, at least not till that, maybe someday 6th edition. And if 5.5e doesn't succeed, that's going to be sooner rather than later. But for now, at least, the industry, and more importantly, the people depending directly on D&D, can breathe a bit of a sigh of relief, though I think the last 3 years have told people to get the heck away from D&D if they want to have a professional company.
And then with the collapse of WotC and where they've kind of fumbled and mismanaged the legacy as stewards of the D&D name, you see a lot of replacements that have entered into the picture. We talked before we went on air about Shadow Dark being one of those, not this year, although like its legacy continued this year, but like Darrington Press with Daggerheart and Matt Colville's Draw Steel being amongst the top competitors in this space. What's your view on their success, which is both wild, and then how do you feel the long term is for both of these games?
Yeah, so Tales of Valiant is of course the other one out. That was Kobold Presses, which came out between Shadow Dark and the one this year. And certainly back in 2023, when the whole OGL stuff was going on, it looked like they were going to be wildly successful. Everyone was so angry at Wizards of the Coast. And Tales of the Valiant, Shadow Dark came out first, very OSR, and so it had an audience, and it's continued very successful. As we talked about before at the start, the West March is Kickstarter, Backerkit, I don't remember which it was. It was one of the things to top $1 million this year. And so that says, hey, Shadow Dark, Kelsey Dion, she really has continued legs there, which doesn't surprise me from everything I've seen. She's a very talented designer and a very talented marketer both. And so that's just a killer combination in the modern market. I think Daggerheart and Draw Steel, they're going to be really the ones that can break out or not for the audience that's interested in D&D. Draw Steel, I wasn't really sure how it was going. And then they did their second Kickstarter, Backerkit, which is running right now, and it's doing phenomenally. It's this is for Crack the Sun. It's their 5-book adventure set. It looks like a beautiful slipcase set that I want to get, even though I don't have Draw Steel right now. It looks so pretty. But it's at, maybe $1.8 million right now as we talk. It's got 21 days left, so I assume it's going to close $3 million plus or minus. That's going to be the biggest success of the year. Shadow Dark was 2.9 million. Maybe Shadow Dark will actually be the biggest one of the year. That was for Western reaches. But Daggerheart's the interesting one, because Daggerheart is, of course, from Darrington Press, as you said. And so that means that it's associated with Critical Role. And so a lot of us thought, wow, is Critical Role going to go over to Daggerheart for their new season 4, which is starting in the new year, starting soon? I know they've done all their announcements about. And I think we were maybe somewhat surprised that, no, they're sticking with D&D. But, they seem to, Critical Role Productions, very much a business. They've obviously made the what works for them is the best decision, and that seems to be keeping Wizards of the Coast happy and staying in with D&D. And I can understand how you'd come about with that, but I feel like they're kind of backdooring Daggerheart in a very interesting way, and that's because of Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford, who were big names at Wizards of the Coast. They left in April, and then they ended up at Darrington Press in June as a creative director and game director. And okay, that's interesting. They're going to have D&D designers, but Daggerheart was probably most of the way done by then. But then we heard just this month that Acquisitions Inc. is moving over to Daggerheart for their new season. And this was apparently kind of foreshadowed at the end of their previous season, which ended with someone changing reality by plunging a dagger into the heart of something or another. And of course, Acquisitions Inc. was created by Chris Perkins back when he was working at Wizards of the Coast. And so that sounds kind of like their backdoor of, we're not going to do it on Critical Role, though they've suggested they're going to do it on kind of some of their subsidiary ones, maybe linked to season 4, just not the main one. But, one of the other biggest and quite possibly the longest running podcast series, Acquisitions Inc., that's going over, and that could give Daggerheart really real legs. So of the 4 big ones that came out of the OGL fiasco, Shadowdark, Drawsteel, and Daggerheart, I think they still remain threats to D&D, and Tales of the Valiant unfortunately seems less so. They seem to still be doing very well. They're having Kickstarters that are coming in at the hundreds of thousands, but it seems to be much more confined to the Kobold Press community. At least I don't see it on the rest of social media the way I do Daggerheart and Drawsteel.
Do you think it's because it's like almost like too similar to Dungeons and Dragons, whereas Drawsteel and Daggerheart have their own take on things and own mechanics and that kind of thing?
I think that's probably a very valid reasoning. I've heard people say that. So yeah, quite possibly.
And then Shannon, can you still believe that there's people that like tune in at that level and like watch live shows like in like arenas? Like when you started in this hobby, could you even imagine a day that was taking place?
No, I mean, the arena shows of Critical Role have just been amazing. Obviously they've been wildly successful, but that's really what's gone to my high success level, seeing those pictures that they're rock stars.
And then I'll ask your opinion on this, is the link between that kind of personality like Matt Colville and his large YouTube subscriber base, and obviously Critical Role, and then to a lesser extent you have folks like I think the Dungeon Coach and DC20, which is essentially like Dungeons and Dragons with a few house rules. But those folks that have like personalities online are able to parlay that into success in a game. Do you feel like there is just smart business acumen that they're taking advantage of that, or is it like just that connection that people have with them and they want to continue that through a game?
I probably all of the above. I mean, it's certainly smart business acumen on the parts of those publishers to put out products, and it's also obviously Matt Colville in particular, I think, because they love being able to put out products. They have had these ideas spinning around their head for decades, and sharing it with people is just the coolest thing. I mean, I think we all feel that as creatives. And so, I wouldn't want to say that their business acumen undercuts their creative design, because it clearly doesn't. And so, those are all there. And I think people want to build those connections too. But I mean, if I like your take of GMing that I see in your YouTube, then I'm going to be interested in the game you create that probably incorporates a lot of those GMing theories. I mean, I know Drawsteel does. I have a history of it in one of my upcoming history books, and it kind of traces some of the ideas that are in some of the early YouTubes to the actual game itself.
Well, even for me, like I couldn't help but go, like when they did the first Kickstarter for Draw Steel and they didn't have a game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, they just did not have a game. Like
Yeah.
it was basically you paying to have them create it. That level of trust in them, earned, but that level of trust is crazy to think about. Can you imagine like pre-ordering a game and yet like they're not even like making it yet? They've got
Yeah.
ideas, but that's about it.
Well, I think you have two things there. On the one hand, we've had almost 15 years of Kickstarter culture here. And so in the role-playing field, we have much more shifted to having the products done before we kickstart them. I think in large part due to early failures. But people understand the products are not completed. I mean, like I said, I just got my dolmen wood this year, and that was definitely running late, and it was definitely still being created and recreated during the process. But that was my 50th, 80th or something Kickstarter that I funded. I have only had one that failed under me, but I understand it's an option. And so, I think we've all kind of gotten used to that. But in the particular case of someone like Matt Colville, he has proven productivity. I mean, you can look and say, wow, he's put out however many hundreds of YouTube videos. He clearly is someone who, has a work ethic, has an ability to convert his creative ideas to real products, et cetera, et cetera. And so that creates a lot of faith too, just as much as, back in the day buying the newest thing from Gary Gygax or whatever. And of course, you might have ended up with Cyborg Commando from that, but still, it was, you had faith in them because of the productivity that they've shown in the past, and all of this digital productivity, all of this YouTube, it's no less valuable than actually producing books.
And speaking of Dolmenwood, nice transition to the OSR and some of the major successes that have come in that area. Osric 3E, they crowdfunded at over 200K. Castle Zagig Galleries of the Archmage, over 600K. We already mentioned Dolmenwood did fabulous, although they had some logistical troubles getting them shipped, and I'm sure that had part to do with tariffs and China and all that. And then Tunnels and Trolls, which is coming soon, as well as Toon 2E, the game I never thought would be 2E, but here we are. That kind of older genre, and people seem to be still interested in that.
Yeah, the Toon 2E is, I think, a much more innovative and groundbreaking book than people realize. It was originally out 1984. So that was the same year as Paranoia, a year before Pendragon. And so way back in that era, it was one of the first games to really model a particular genre of play and to, use its game rules to mold how people played and to make it reflect things. And the other two I mentioned, Paranoia and King Arthur, that was because they were both in that era too. Ghostbusters is the other one, big one there, Amber kind of at the tail end. But I mean, this idea that you could just get knocked down rather than killed, and any number of other things, greatly groundbreaking. And so it's thrilling that Steve Jackson Games is putting it out again. The third edition of Ostrich, it struck me as particularly important because it really shows that the whole OSR is entering, I don't know, second generation, third generation, something like that. We've seen it fairly constantly evolving, but the fact that these retro clones that have kind of defined the early parts of the industry are now coming back in new forms, and Ostrich is still very true to the original AD&D 2E, though I believe it has like ascending AC as a option now, and a few other variants like that have become somewhat more popular in the OSR. But just the fact that they're able to do a new edition 15 years on, I guess, says, hey, this is continued to evolve. And Dolmenwood's really part of that too, because Dolmenwood, of course, grew out of Old School Essentials, and Old School Essentials, of course, was the second major retro clone for BX after Labyrinth Lord. And so, you're starting to get third generation, fourth generation. It's just been evolving really quickly. And so it's been really neat to see so much innovation there. Dolmenwood's near the top of my list of games I'd like to play right now, because it has that BX chassis, which was what I started playing D&D with. A really neat hex crawl, and just innovative in classes and ancestries and stuff. So it's great to see all of these coming back. And you asked me when we talked about some of these topics later, what is there from that era that hasn't been brought back? I'm like, wow, that's a good question. And it is, I'm sure if we dug, we could find some, games from 1983, say the Mechanoid Invasion, though the Mechanoid Invasion is a sourcebook and riffs now, but I'm sure we could find things. There was an old Egyptian game. There's Man, Myth, and Magic. There's a number of small ones, but anything big that, had a dozen supplements, the vast majority of them, if there aren't licensing problems like for Mill-earth role-playing, they're out again now.
And Labyrinth Lord actually snuck out a new edition here, like in the last few weeks, just with little fanfare, really. It just kind of, there it is, it's out. So
wow.
I was kind of surprised.
I did not know that, because he'd been working on the second edition and, with new classes, other things really going further away from BX, and then he just disappeared a year and a half ago. And so I'm thrilled to hear it came out. I'm gonna have to go look at that.
It probably could have been a very, very successful Kickstarter, but for whatever reason, it's just out. And back like the old days where it's like all of a sudden it's on your bookshelves. And then the OSR is not without its own controversies. Goodman Games publishing the City State of the Invincible Overlord.
Yeah, I personally find that a hard question, because the current owners of the City State of the Invincible Overlord, Bob Bledsaw Jr. and Bob Bledsaw III, who are the son and grandson of Bob Bledsaw, who was one of the co-founders of the original Judges Guild, they're scumbags. They are anti-Semitic, they are anti-LGBT, they hate people. And they hate people for racial and religious reasons. And so they have been rightfully ostracized. And people rightfully don't want to see them get any money. So they did a Kickstarter for City State 2019, 2020, something like that, for their own edition of it. And they totally failed to produce it, because besides being bigots, they also don't seem to know what the hell they're doing for producing products. And so Joseph Goodman has been doing his original adventures reincarnated. He did 6 great classic D&D TSR products, and then he did a couple of Janelle Jaquet's products, and this was going to be the 10th maybe, or something like that. And he said, I want to do City State. We've worked with Judges Guild previously. We stopped doing new products with them, but this is one that we've had on our list for years and years, and people weren't happy with that. People did not want to see money going to Judges Guild, and again, I understand that 100%. And so Joseph came up with this compromise where he said, okay, we're gonna do our best to make sure no money goes to Judges Guild. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to refund the people from that original Judges Guild City State failed Kickstarter with the money that would have gone to royalties. And we're not going to produce the product after the Kickstarter to make sure there's no additional royalties. And so the only way they will get any money is if the Kickstarter is so successful that we pay out all of the original backers and there's extra money. And, if there's that, then we have to, because that's our royalty agreement. Seems like a pretty good compromise to me. People were still unhappy. They felt like it was going to free up Judges Guild because they'd have all this debt off of their back and they could, go and produce products on their own again. I don't think that's likely, because see the part earlier about they don't know what the hell they're doing. And the city-state Kickstarter from Goodman was very successful. It's going to get back into print, and then it's going to disappear. And so, like I said, I totally understand all of this, not wanting to give the money to the anti-Semites and the, homophobes. I totally agree with that. But what do we do in a situation like this where a truly historic product for our industry is controlled by someone like that? I mean, it feels deeply problematic to me, and maybe this is just because I'm a historian, to, just consign these, products from our history to never be seen again when they were important for, the development of our industry. I mean, I would have liked to see Goodman Games do one of their big Judges Guild books that they did, and clearly aren't doing anymore, which, were full of the original product and lots of commentary on them and all of that. They did the one for Janelle Jacqui, and they did another one that was a couple of the biggest early Judges Guild products, both as these really big oversized hardcovers. And those were just great historical artifacts. And they'll have a little bit of that in the original Adventures Reincarnated. They always have, like 20 pages at the start with interviews and other cool content like that. But I think it's a real dilemma that we're going to face in the modern day. And, how do we deal with it? And, the very purist just, don't touch it at all, that denies us things too. And so we're going to have to figure out where that line is. And maybe the line is it never gets published again until we force these people to sell it or they die or whatever. And we'll see.
Well, I know Joseph Goodman is one of those. He's a very savvy business person. You can just see the way he operates. And I think he might have got even blindsided by the pushback on it, and perhaps even an uncharacteristic, unforced error towards what he's doing. But like you said, it's a complicated situation.
Yeah, I think you're right there. He backtracked very quickly on the original post and very quickly tried to find common ground. So that does suggest to me that he was surprised by the level of response.
And then just closing off kind of the OSR, and let's maybe just the other indie stuff in the space. Apocalypse World 3E Burned Over in the story game area. That seemed to have another successful Kickstarter. It didn't seem to me to be like necessarily like a big innovation on it, but I think it was almost like paying alms to the work that Apocalypse World has put in and shared their platform, I guess, with so many other games. I think a lot of people appreciate the work of the names escape me. I'm trying. What's their names?
The Bakers.
The Bakers, yeah, Vincent Baker and
Megway.
And Megway, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think Apocalypse World is one of the most impactful games produced in the last 15 years. It was produced about 15 years ago. The way it created a whole subgenre of play is amazing. And it was deeply innovative too. Certainly, I've been able to find player-facing role systems going back to at least the 90s, where the players are the ones doing all the rolling, taking the actions, and the GM is responding to it, which is what Apocalypse World does. But no one else had been able to actually make it successful. And, then the Bakers, they created this whole subcategory of play on that. And I mean, it was also the deep genre work that appears in Apocalypse World, the fact that it was a more adult role-playing game. Yes, that does include sex, all of that all made it a very different game that was going to get a lot of attention. But it was, wildly more successful than anyone could have imagined back in 2010. And so it is great to see it getting more attention now. I think it's actually going to come in almost exactly where Designers and Dragons Origins came in. It's got 4 days left as we're talking. And so my guess is it's going to hit about 250,000 too, but we'll see. But it's great to see him getting the attention.
Yeah, I mean, and as you said, like as far as indie game design, I would say like so many more games are made with the Powered by the Apocalypse than almost any other system out there, just because it's so accessible, and especially if you're not maybe coming into role-playing games with like a long history of like mechanics and that kind of stuff. It's very accessible and easy to adapt.
Yeah, yeah, I think you got D&D, and then way down, but possibly number 2 is Powered by the Apocalypse, especially if you include Forged in the Dark, Year Zero, and some of the other things that kind of branched off some of the philosophies that originated in Powered by the Apocalypse. So yeah, that's why I say it's so impactful.
And then speaking of Forged in the Dark, there's also Tribes in the Dark, the Tribe 8 update with Forged in the Dark or Blaze in the Dark rules.
Yeah, and that speaks, I think, to how successful indie games are at kind of breaking into the mainstream. Tribe 8 was a crunchy role-playing game put out in the 90s, I think, and so seeing a new edition of it that instead adopts indie ideals, and like I just said, the Year Zero games, which are from the Free League, they are built on indie ideals largely too, and so those are great examples of how much it's influenced and how different the field is now than it was, before a little game called Sorcerer came out and kind of kicked off this whole indie revolution.
And moving on to, we already touched on League Gold's A&E, but other periodicals in the space that are either struggling, some are succeeding though. Like, I guess, what's your take on how some of these are playing out as far as being a periodical?
Yeah, periodicals are really a difficult category for a couple of different reasons. Um, the biggest thing is they're expensive to produce, and people expect them to be cheap to buy. And I think that's because of all of our experience, seeing People Magazine or whatever else on the newsstands, and you get 80, 100, I don't know, glossy pages for, I actually don't know how much they cost anymore. I know how much role-playing magazines cost, but not the ones you get at the newsstand. But they have all of these benefits of, being able to sell millions of copies and being able to sell advertisements to, millions of eyeballs and all of that, which our role-playing industry has never had. And so we've long seen this cycle of someone comes in, they create a magazine because they're really enthusiastic about the industry. They create a beautiful magazine, has lots of great content. They're very successful. They start doing other things because they want to expand into the industry. They realize the other things are a lot more cost effective, and then they kill the magazine. I think White Wolf is probably the biggest example. But Shadis followed the same pattern. And even when already existing companies came in and produced magazines like Different Worlds from Chaosium, or The Space Gamer, which was picked up by Steve Jackson, they run them for a few years and then they pass them on or shut them down. It's hard to find a periodical in the industry that has run more than 10 years. There's clearly one or two handfuls of exceptions. But one of the things that struck me this year was, I think with A&E gone, the two longest running periodicals probably are Pathfinder Adventure Path and Knights of the Dinner Table magazine. And both of them dropped back their production this year. Pathfinder Adventure Path said, we're going to put out quarterly books that are like 256 pages. And Knights of the Dinner Table said, we're going to drop back to 64 pages, which I think they've been at before. And we're going to go bi-monthly instead of monthly. And so they both said, hey, it's too expensive to produce monthly at least. We're at least going to double or triple our effort. And Pathfinder, I think, was always the interesting example of, how can we maybe make magazines successful in the industry? And they said, you're going to pay what it actually costs for the magazine. Because they were doing Dragon and Dungeon before 4E caused Wizards Coast to pull them back. And those were running, I don't know, $8 an issue or something when they closed down. And then they started up Pathfinder and they said, this is going to be our monthly magazine. It's going to be 64 or 80 pages, just like those. It's going to be square bound instead of saddle stitch, but we're charging $20 for this because that's the cost. And they were much more sold as, individual adventures than, Dungeon ever was. But still, it was, one of the first things I'd seen in the industry that said, hey, magazines are much more expensive. This is what they really cost. If you want to get your magazine every month, this is what you need to pay. And still, even now, I guess 15 years on from Pathfinder, almost 20, they've said we need to drop it back to a quarterly, which doesn't really make it a magazine at that point. The OSR.
Yeah, there's some other bright spots, though. The Crusader Journal, the Fight On, Knock, Weird Science.
Yeah, the OSR has really been the place where we've seen most of the success. And I think that's because the OSR is still so focused on what were those things that we remember or we liked or we found successful from when we played or when other people played, back at the dawn of role-playing, whatever the dawn is defined. And one of those things was periodical. So Knock is a gorgeously produced magazine that is more OSR focused. And they've been doing one every year, two every year, somewhere between the one and the other. And they just, offer each new one on Kickstarter, and it's great. But as you said, the Crusader Journal, which had been on hiatus for I don't even know how many years, and Fight On, which had been on hiatus again for I don't know how many years, they both returned. Fight On last year, Crusader Journal this year, both OSR focused. But Weird Science, I think, is a great example of one that's not OSR focused, and one of my favorite current magazines. And that's not just because I write for it, but it's because they're really looking at the industry in a deep way that in 10 or 15 or 20 years is just going to be just as crucial for writing the history of the 10s and the 20s as Space Gamer and Different Worlds and some of the other ones that I mentioned were crucial for when I wrote my histories of the 70s and 80s. It's really a neat analytical magazine that's kind of unlike anything else in the industry. And so I'm very pleased it's continuing on. Issue 7's going to be out very soon, or maybe that's out and 8's out soon. So I tell people, look at it.
I got to ask you, were you a Dungeon or a Dragon magazine fan? What was your go-to?
Dragon. I think even then liked the look at the wider industry, the news columns, even the letter columns in the forums, where Dungeon was just adventures. And, if I wanted adventures, I'd get the newest module from TSR, and my disposable income as a kid wasn't enough to buy all of their modules. So why would I also get a magazine? But Dragon I loved. And it's, I think, because it was much more a slice of life of the industry history, even though I would not have described it as such then.
Yeah, very similar to me. I remember, I wouldn't get a subscription to it because I just wanted to go to the store and buy it myself. I'd buy every single one, but I always looked forward to it, and I looked forward to seeing the letters and the opinion pieces and all that kind of stuff. It very much was like today's modern world of podcasts and blogs and just all the discussion about tabletop role-playing games. And probably the only reason I'm sitting here talking to you is because I used to love reading Dragon magazines. And Dungeon magazine, I was like, I can make my own adventure. That's the fun.
Yeah, I had a subscription to Dragon magazine a couple of times. I knew I did in high school, and I did in the Peso days too. But I actually had a subscription to Dungeon in the Peso days too, and I ran entirely through Savage Tide, which was their last big adventure path that they wrote. So I got use out of Dungeon too. I mean, that was a 3-year campaign I think I ran for my old Berkeley group.
Moving on to crowdfunding, and we already talked about your successful crowdfunding and Backerkit. But just let's go over some of these other really successful. We talked about the Western Reaches for Shadow Dark. What's the actual? I forget the actual name of it. Everybody calls it Shadow Reach. I don't even remember the name of it, to be honest with you. But it's Western Reaches. But 2.8 million, a Fabula Ultima Celebration Edition, 1.7 million. The Void Sea, which is a 5e setting, of 1 million. Fallen London, which is a IP game, 1.4 million. That's on Kickstarter. We already talked about Crack the Sun, Draw Steel. It's like 1.7 million and climbing. That could be potentially 6 million. The World's Largest Dungeon for 5e, 1 million. Tangled in the Web, which is Magnus Archives by Monty Cook Games. He's been pretty quiet. Like, I mean, they have a core fan base, but 1 million. So those are some big numbers and even looking back 10 years ago, what was expected in a crowdfunding campaign and what is being achieved by some of these lesser known games is amazing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I particularly don't understand the number of 5e crowdfundings that surpassed $1 million from companies I've never heard of before. And that's not true from like Voidsea. Voidsea was Loot Tavern and two other notable publishers who we've seen before. But in the past, there have been a lot of publishers who I'm like, who's that? And they made $1 million off of it. So, I mean, speaks again to the success of 5e. The thing that I found most notable about this year's charts, well, first of all, as you say, yeah, the $1 million, it's where I'm marking my measure now because I used to do it at 100,000, and the last year I did that, which was probably 2019, I had like 100 and some games that I was trying to record, which took, a couple of work days to do. It was COVID, and I don't understand why or how, but it was COVID. 2020 is the year that you saw the break, and suddenly the crowdfunding that year hit 357. I don't remember what it was there. Somewhere in that range of $1 million crowdfundings for role-playing games, and we've dropped down. Like I said, 3 or 5 was the lowest. 7 seems to be the medium, the one that we've seen the most often, and that's what we saw this year. But what struck me this year is that 4 of them were on Kickstarter and 3 of them were on Backerkit. And this is the first year that we've seen some level of parity like that. I think before that, we might have only had 1. No, I think it was 2. I think we had 2 Backerkits that were in role-playing and crossed the $1 million before. Draw Steel, and I think maybe the original Magnus Archives. I think they were both on Backerkit.
Or Cosmere, or...
Oh, Cosmere too, but Cosmere, didn't that have non-role-playing stuff in it too? I'm not sure. But that was another big one. The Gloomhaven one was on Backerkit too, but again, that was both the second edition and the role-playing game. So that might be what I'm thinking about for the Cosmere. Maybe the Cosmere was just the role-playing. But yeah, we had about as many this year as we'd had to date on Backerkit, and more so, it was almost half of the crowdfunding, which means Backerkit is really increasingly eating Kickstarter's lunch in the role-playing field, at least. And I mean, I think that's because Kickstarter got complacent and said, we don't need to do this, Backerkit stuff. We have someone doing it for us, and everyone used it, and Backerkit was smart enough to just say, well, we should just start our own. But when I've been working on Designers and Dragons of the 20s and even some of my updated histories for the 10s and stuff, I see more and more publishers going over to Backerkit. And so I'd kind of wondered a year or two if we were going to see that, and it looks like it's really happening now. I mean, mine was on Backerkit, and that's what Evil Hat's using. And the big threat previously was if you got off Kickstarter and you tried to go to one of the others, Indiegogo, whatever, they weren't nearly as successful. And Backerkit seems to be.
Well, even speaking from my own experience, I was happy to see that Kickstarter added the pledge manager, and you're like, okay, finally, like a little late, but okay, good. But Backerkit just seems to have way more tools for the touch points throughout the whole campaign, whereas in Kickstarter, you kind of have that initial push, and then you have to wait for that 48-hour and 8-hour announcement. And even then, like, that's not really gonna, if those people are busy, not checking their email, or just not that interested, you don't have those touch points. So there's like that real long stretch in the middle that is just like from indie developer is like heartbreaking. Like you're just sitting there going, nothing's kind of happening here. And so Backerkit has way more touch points, way more opportunities to communicate and like put out information. So I will probably not use Kickstarter again myself just for that reason. I just found that like super frustrating. I was going to maybe make a whole video about that, just to talk about my experiences. But Backerkit on top of that now has gone into there's that collaboration funding for so we saw it last November with Mothership Month, and then they did it once again for this year. And then we also had Mouse Ritter Month, and then which partially crossed over for Mothership Month. And we just saw the recent announcement of Old School Essentials Month with kind of a demon theme for next, I think, May or March. I can't quite remember. It was an M month. But anyways, in 2026. And so these months are now taking place. And I'm going to throw this question back at you because I also want to maybe do a video about this. So I'm valuing your opinion here. Is do they eat all the oxygen for indie gamers, indie game designers, if it's like Mothership Month and there's like 15 products and they have this like coordinated mailing and cheaper and all that kind of stuff? Is it going to eat into other indie games? Not like maybe the way D&D does, where maybe they bring such a large volume that like the indie games feed on the scraps, but this is like the scraps and it's all being used up by these bigger ecosystems like Mothership or OSE or Mouse Ritter.
Yeah, I think that's likely to have an impact. It looks like the OSE one is next May for anyone who's interested. I'm following it along with 1,400 people already, which speaks well to how well all this works now. But I think that if I'm dumping out money on OSE stuff in OSE month, that I'm probably not going to be dumping out money on, Mouse Ritter or something else. Now, might I be buying a one-off indie game that I see on Kickstarter or something that looks cool? I think that might not impact me from that, but it feels to me at least that for these months, I'm likely to be buying supplements for games that I already have. And so that might impact my buying supplements for something else, but not necessarily if I see a, one-off game that I'd be afraid I might not be able to get otherwise.
Well, it remains to be seen. I'm a little worried about this, to be honest with you, because my North Star is indie games, and if you almost have to buy into their ecosystem in order to kind of like succeed in it. Not to say it's not possible, but that's my concern for indie game designers.
Yeah, I feel like it's a game changer, and so whether it's going to be a good game changer or a bad game changer, you can certainly put that up in the air. But the fact that smaller press, OSE, Mouse Ritter, Mothership people, we're not just talking about the big publishers, though they're clearly included there. But someone who puts out a random supplement for it, the fact that they can get some real attention for it, that's pretty amazing, I think. And so that's going to be really beneficial to them. But your question of whether it's going to impact the larger ecosystem, the newer games coming out that people don't know about, that's a valid concern. But right now they're at 3 months worth of this. If they are starting to get to one every month, I'd have more concerns.
Well, and I guess like you can spitball and think of other systems that could potentially do that, and then you're like using up the whole calendar. The only currently free one is like Zine Month for like indie designers, where you've got like at least that ecosystem benefiting your weird oddball game, which is my jam as far as what I like to see out there. But Shannon, what are you up to as we come to the close here? Like you had your successful Kickstarter, Backerkit, I should say. I keep calling everything a Kickstarter. It's like Kleenex.
Yeah.
But what are you working on next? What's the next steps for you?
So I continue to do my best to keep half of my work schedule free for working on my own stuff. And I have been working on products like this for 6 years now. And Designers and Dragons Origins was just the first really major set of things that came out, though of course I had This Is Free Trader Beowulf the year before. So I have other products that are almost done. One thing is that I have been continuing to write new company histories as a couple of book expansion for the original Designers and Dragons. And so I have 3 volumes of that. I have 2 called The Lost Histories, one of which covers more companies in the 70s and 80s, one of which covers more companies in the 90s and the aughts. And then I have The Tins, which was probably the most requested book after I put out the original. And so those are almost done. I've written probably all of the company histories. I am close to halfway done editing those and actually putting them into book form. And so my plan is to close them out in spring. And I say almost all the company histories because The Tins, the goal was for it to be about 180,000 words, which is bigger than the other books. And I've been writing these for 5 years, 6 years, which means that some of them are kind of outdated now. And so I didn't know how much content was going to get added when I updated those. And so I might write 1 or 2 more, but very close to those. I am going to hand those off to Evil Hat. My guess is March or April. And those books are kind of in a funny place because the original Designers and Dragons are more than 10 years old now, and they're out of print in the offset edition, so you can still get them digitally in pod. And they're out of date. And so we want to offer these as, hey, if you have the original set, here's some nice supplements for it. But they're not going to be a 3rd edition yet, and we're going to do a 3rd edition afterwards. So we've kind of talked about maybe we're just going to do a casual release, as pod and PDF, maybe not Kickstarter, but I don't know. All I know is I need to hand them to Evil Hat in March or April, and we've talked about some, but we'll make final decisions then. The other product that I am working on very actively right now are the sequel to Designers and Dragons Origins. And so Designers and Dragons Origins, which is now available for pre-order through the Backerkit site. It covered basic D&D, AD&D first edition, and OD&D, and a little bit of Mystara for AD&D second edition, just to have that all together. So obviously, the next thing that you could do there is AD&D second edition. And I've got 6 books mapped out for AD&D in second edition, covering everything from 1989 when it came out to 2000, just before Wizards of the Coast rebooted as 3E. And they're kind of the last ones that I am fairly definitively going to put together, though I've actually written a bunch of a 5e book too. And so I've been doing about 1 a year, which is the same thing I did for the original. And so I've pretty much taken this month off from other priorities except my tech writing, and I'm trying to finish out the second AD&D second edition book. And so I've had Dark Sun in front of me for a couple of weeks now. And so those are all the things that are being actively worked on. And the second edition books, my guess is 4 more years, and I'll hand them to Evil Hat because, like I said, 6 books a book a year.
Hardest working man in the TTRPG space. There's no slowing you down.
That used to be Stephen Long, who always shocked me with his 1,000,000 words a year that he did when he was working for Hero Games. But I haven't heard him doing that lately since Hero Games passed hands. But I try and get a good amount of work in. I think the fact that I do tech writing actually helps because tech writing gets me with my butt sitting in this chair 2 to 3 days a week. And so it's a lot easier to, do the other 2 to 3 days a week rather than, go to the beach or go hike in the hills or something.
And you just reminded me, I've actually been meaning to circle back on Hero Games and go, what's going on there? Because I know different ownerships and all that kind of stuff. It's an interesting story, long history, and interesting story to see where it's at. And could that be ripe for another new edition? Okay, I know they kind of had that, but
yeah, that's, I certainly am going to be circling back to all of those companies because the 3rd edition of Designers and Dragons is in the cards. We're going to incorporate the original 4 books, the 3 books I'm going to finish up next year, update everything. I don't even know how many years in the future that is. I kind of want to rewrite all of the original stuff, but we'll see if that actually happens. At the least, I want to re-reference it all because I have really great references in my new books, and I don't have great references in the old books because I didn't know people were going to want it. So need to go back through all of my magazines and everything else. And so 3rd edition, talk about hero games. I think they're owned by the City of Heroes people now, but I'm not sure. It's been a few years since I've looked at it.
I was on their website a couple months ago just thinking about that. Like, I've got some old games, and it seems like it's still there, but they're not like pushing it like they used to, and maybe a refresh might be in order.
Yeah.
Predictions for next year. So put your get your crystal ball out. What are you seeing based upon the year past and changes of technology, economy? What are you thinking?
I think it is likely next year is going to be a tough year. I think that all of the tariff and other really bad economic decisions are going to send the economy cratering, and I think AI is going to fail into that. And role-playing companies always work on a narrow enough margin that that's going to be difficult for them. On the other hand, it's gotten so cheap to publish that you can just step back to digital. But I think it's going to be a hard year. I think we might see some companies disappear, but I've said that in other years too. And I mean, one of my takeaways from this year was, I can't believe how terrible this year was. And most people are still doing pretty good. But I have a little bit of a doom and gloom, as I suspect a lot of people in the United States do. And I think it's mostly about the economy at this moment. And so we'll see. I mean, we'll see more great products. We'll see more innovations. I mean, I'm looking forward to the 50th anniversary of Traveler, though that's still another year out. But, you know, we're going to be hearing more about that.
Yeah, they just announced the new edition coming out. Is that correct?
Oh, I didn't hear that. If so,
I thought
they just came out with Sandy Antunes's, I think it's called Pioneer, which is kind of a new Traveler set in system. But there may be a new core game too. But they just updated all of their core books in 2022 to 24 or something. But could be there's a new edition of that too that I just haven't heard of yet.
Okay, so now we're moving on to you know, a sad part of the show that we look back upon those that we've lost over this last year and that have made contributions to our little hobby, and great and small, and just talk about their moment of like what they did for us as a community. And first among them is Ernie Gygax.
Yeah, Ernie Gygax, one of Gary Gygax's sons. You know, he worked at the Dungeon Hobby Shop, maybe TSR proper, when he was young. His biggest impact, I think, is kind of invisible because he was one of the early players, and we don't quite see that, but we see the reflections of it. We see like the Water Weird, which is one of the creatures that we created. He's credited for it in the original Monster Manual. We see Tinzer, who's still a character in the Greyhawk setting. So yeah, certainly one of the earliest players of D&D who we've lost there.
And Scott Herring, whose work was mostly with Steve Jackson.
Yeah, I think he at one time said that he had worked for Steve Jackson like 6 different times or something like that. So he was constantly returning to them. Scott was largely an editor. And editors largely don't get a lot of attention in the industry. You know, we see the writer's name and we don't necessarily see the editor behind him who's making sure that writing looks good and is thoughtful and such. But the fact that a lot of people do know Scott Herring's name says what a great editor he was. And I know him mostly through magazines because that's where I know a lot of people mostly. When he came on at Steve Jackson, he did Auto Duel Quarterly, and he also did Pyramid slightly more recently. He was a designer too. He, you know, did things for TSR like Empire of the Sands, one of the early Forgotten Realms setting books, and Empire of Darroken, which was one of the known world settings. But probably editor is where he did most of his work.
And we have, and hopefully I can pronounce this correctly, Francois Marcella Fordeval.
Yeah.
Francois was with Cassius Bell.
Yeah,
Really?
Francois was one of the founders of the role-playing industry in France, and that was with Casus Belli, a magazine that he founded in 1980, which was really early for European publications in the role-playing industry, which is still going today. I don't know if it's had any interruptions or not, but it's certainly still going. But we know of him more widely because he came over to TSR, and he was one of Gary Gygax's early right-hand men. He's credited with like the comeliness stat in Unearthed Arcana, and he did the original. I don't. Yeah, he produced a draft of Oriental Adventures, which, as I understand it, was never actually used, and might have been like 20 or 30 pages or something. But that was the kind of work that he was doing there. But probably his Casus Belli work was more notable for the industry as a whole. And his time at TSR was pretty short. When he went back to France, he did a very long-running Euro comic called The Black Moon Chronicles, which is theoretically set in Western Greyhawk. An old tie to his old friend Gary's work.
And we also have Rob Weiland.
Yeah, Rob Weiland. If you look on RPG Geek or somewhere, he has a very impressive list of credits, like 70 or 80 products or something. But what struck me is after his passing, all of the people coming out saying what a great advocate he was for the hobby, because, he wrote for various online magazines, he attended conventions, he did panels, and more so everyone talking about not just what a great advocate he was, but what a great person he was. I saw more outpouring of grief for him than possibly anyone else except Ernie Gygax over the course of the year, which I think speaks to how impactful he was.
And then this one surprised me because I wasn't aware of it until just towards when we were preparing the list here. But William Bud Baird of Bud's RPG Review, which I've seen countless of his videos, and I was saddened to hear of his loss.
Yeah, and he was a Call of Cthulhu author as well.
Yeah, so if people recognize that name, Bud's RPG Review, if you're on YouTube, I'm sure you have seen him talking about some games. And then Rebecca Heinemann.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us know her from the Bard's Tale and any number of Electronic Arts, I think, publications around that time. She was one of the co-founders. Of course, she was also Janelle Jaquet's long-term partner, wife. And we, of course, lost Janelle about a year ago, too. And so I think that brought it even more home that we're losing so many of these classic designers.
And Pete Nifton.
Yeah, he was Games Workshop fighting fantasy artist. I always loved the style of the, kind of 1980s GW artwork, and he was one of the ones doing that work.
And Al Lenardi.
Yeah, he was the designer of Ace of Aces, which was I think still very innovative, one-on-one dogfight aerial combat game that, of course, also led to Lost Worlds, where you instead had one-on-one fights between fantasy characters. And the extent of his influence, I think, can best be stated by, if you remember the fact that there were Lost Worlds for the Knights of the Dinner Table characters at one point. So there we go. Someone who was designing in the 70s, and his impact is on, one of the biggest magazines still being published today.
And Paul Sawyer.
Yeah, he was a Games Workshop editor. I don't know much more about his work, but of course I just spoke about how editors often don't get the credit that they deserve, so we can at least remember him here.
And Ian Strauss.
Yeah, he was an author for the Johnstown Compendium, and thus one of the people who was able to, creatively, show us what they were interested in and what they knew, thanks to the new ways to publish in the 21st century.
And then I'm sure we may have missed others, but we also just learned before we recorded this about Rob Reiner and his loss. And I know just from a personal note myself, like, I mean, Princess Bride is so, like, I love that movie, as many people do, and just sad that the circumstances ended up that way for him.
Yeah, it's inconceivable that
Yeah.
that he's not around anymore, that he was murdered. And yeah, he obviously wasn't a role-playing person, but it was The Princess Bride that made me think of him for here too, because I don't know if it's just people our age or if it's everyone in the fantasy community, but that, very impactful for all of us. And I felt like for people our age that some of his other things from the same era, like This Is Spinal Tap, and also
Stand By Me, and there's
Stand By
When
Me.
Harry Met Sally, and and of course I grew up watching him as Meathead
Yeah, I did too.
on
Yeah,
Archie
we're
Bunker. So
both old enough for that. So, but yeah, Stand By Me is just another one of those, I think maybe for people our age, kind of pivotal coming of age films. And so, yeah, I remember Rob Reiner too.
yeah, well, if we did miss anybody, our apologies, and feel free to make note or send them our way, and we'll do our best to include them. And before we play out the in memoriam with highlighting some of these folks that we just talked about, Shannon, I just want to say thanks again for joining me again this year, and look forward to seeing more of your work. And you know, role-playing games are awesome, and I love the community, and I love everything that they represent as far as creativity. And I appreciate that you've been able to, through your work, make sure that that's always captured.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure being here, and always a pleasure having your help seeing things that I might have missed otherwise when talking about the year and what's been going on.